So this panel is part of a segment called, as was emphasized, Retour au texte. I'm going to do exactly the opposite. In fact, what I will do, instead of going back to text, is actually leaving them, or leaving a text, and using them as a point of departure, but also as an entry point into a discussion of how the literary production of the Western European Enlightenment was subjected, I think, in the course of its migration towards the margins of Europe and beyond, to a series of radical transformations, reappropriations, and even reformatings that almost made it, as in the case that I will discuss today, shows, I think, unrecognizable, or at the very least, irretrievably hybridized and really other to itself. I also want to emphasize that, as a preliminary remark, that the case I have chosen to discuss today, which you might have guessed from my here, is Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's Paul et Virginie, itself occupies, I think, a bit of a liminal position within the canon of Enlightenment prose fiction. Although its author undoubtedly deserved the title of Homme des Lumières, the novel itself constitutes, I would argue, a form of bastardized Enlightenment literature, one in which some key ideas of Enlightenment philosophy seem to have trickled down, so to speak, in a very simplified form into what could be called really popular melodrama. So, originally published as an appendix to the third volume of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's Études de la Nature from 1788, Paul et Virginie constitute the first foray of its author into the genre of sentimental fiction. The plot of the novel is probably familiar to most of you, but I will summarize it very quickly nonetheless. Set in the luxuriant landscapes of Mauritius, present-day Mauritius, the novel tells the tragic love story of Paul and Virginie, the children of two French widows living with their respective slaves in an isolated corner of the island. Raised together away from civilization, the two young protagonists are separated when Virginie is forcefully taken back to France by distant relatives. The novel ends with the death of both lovers, the loss of Virginie in the wreck of the ship that brings her back from Europe being shortly followed by Paul's own passing. For all the naivete of its subject matter, the novel's Rousseauist celebration of uncorrupted life in nature ensured its enduring popularity through the Romantic Age and beyond, as evidenced by the multitude of translations, adaptations, and reprints throughout the 19th century and even into the 20th century. Unsurprisingly, for a work with such a broad international circulation in the late 18th century and throughout the 19th century, as I said, Paul et Virginie was translated into at least 6 of the literary languages of the Ottoman Empire, or at least read in 6 of them, as, for instance, all of the Greek and Armenian translations of the novel were, in fact, published outside of the empire itself, although evidence shows that these very translations circulated widely among Greeks and Armenians living within the boundary of the empire. Additionally, it is worth noting that Paul et Virginie was among a relatively small number of Western European novels that by the end of the 19th century had already been translated several times in some of these languages. I open a small parenthesis. Not only was the novel translated and read a great deal in the Ottoman Empire, but it's interesting to trace also the presence of a series of fictional characters that are presented to be reading the novel. And this is a very, very partial list. And I start actually with perhaps more famous examples from French literature, starting in the Romantic period with Indiana by Georges Sand. There's a direct reference. Madame Bovary, of course, is introduced to us as a reader of Paul et Virginie. And then I apologize for the Bulgarian speakers in the room. I hope my translation is correct, but there is, and this is, I know that from a secondary source, so I might have to be corrected, but there is a mention, a reference in an early Bulgarian prose fiction example. Later on in the 1880s, in what belongs to the first sort of generation of Turkish Ottoman Turkish novelist in a famous novel called Sergüzeşt. The novel plays an important part as sort of subtext. and again, it's a very partial list, but I found another reference in a very little-known novel, Greek novel published in Istanbul called Peripetia Mias Οικογένειας, The Adventures of a Family. And it continues into the 20th century. The last example is from the second constitutional period. And again, the plot of Paul et Virginie and Paul et Virginie as an object is woven into the plot of that novel. But let us go back to translation itself and start with the reception of the text in the Turkish language. The publication history of Paul et Virginie in Ottoman Turkish is a relatively complicated one, and I will summarize it very quickly. A first drastically shortened version of the text was penned by Emin Siddiq and published serially in 1870. It was followed by at least two other translations until the end of the 19th century, one by Ahmed Atta, whose serialization seems to have been interrupted after only a few installments, and another one by Osman Sena in 1894, which seems to have been a victim of Hamidian censorship. Now, the first known Armenian translation of the novel was published by the Mechitarist Fathers in Venice in 1860, while in the Greek case, a first version, now presumed to be lost, seems to have circulated in manuscript form already in the Danubian principalities in the late 18th century. And it was followed, this early lost version, by a second one published in Paris in the early years of the War of Independence, and by at least another two until the end of the 19th century. Finally, the novel was translated twice into Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, but in the early 20th century, in 1901 and 1905, the first and longest of these two translations into Ladino of Paul et Virginie was the work of Sara Simantov, or Simantov, and I mention her because she's one of very few known female translators of foreign prose fiction into Ladino in the late Ottoman period. And I believe, and again, I might be wrong, that the first Bulgarian translation is from 1850. So today, in my exploration of what I would like to call the commodification of this novel in the literatures of the late Ottoman Empire, I will focus on the second of these two Ladino translations of Paul et Virginie and analyze it alongside not a translation proper, but an Armenian novel, original, seemingly unrelated to Paul et Virginie, but which I shall argue conceals in a rather curious way a subtle but powerful reference to Paul et Virginie's plot. And I will begin with that novel. In the short span of his lifetime, Armenak Haykuni, which was the pen name of Armenak Çizmeciyan, born in 1835, and he died very young at 31, he managed to produce a body of work that left a mark on both drama and prose in Western Armenian literature. A journalist and a publisher, Haykuni founded the short-lived periodical Musaik Masyats, the Muses of Masis, the first Armenian publication entirely devoted to theater, as well as the periodical Tsarig, Flower, in the early 1860s. In parallel, he contributed to the political, educational, and scholarly debate of his time in a series of publications that promoted rational and scientific thought and were marked by a strong anti-clericalism. Published in 1861 in Smyrna, Eliza, or a recent event that took place during the Eastern War meaning the Crimean War, was Haykuni's only novel and constituted, at the time of its publication, the second attempt at original novel writing in the Western Armenian dialect. Set against the backdrop of the Crimean War, Eliza follows the troubled love story between a narrator, a young Armenian from Istanbul, hired as a translator by the British Army and stationed in the seaside city of Varna in present-day Bulgaria, and the young Italian girl of aristocratic birth, the titular Eliza. The first few chapters of the work document the sort of nascent love of the two protagonists, who must face at once the consequences of a dark family history on Eliza's side and the narrator's own very precarious position as the Crimean War unfolds. In the beginning of the novel, in every scene, every element, in terms of setting or tone, or in terms of the character's demeanor or the dialogues, is strongly reminiscent of the sentimental novel of the late Enlightenment period. In a chapter simply entitled Love, Ser in Armenian, Eliza and the narrator come close to confessing their love to one another, when they are interrupted by the entrance of Eliza's mother, As the two characters struggle to hide their emotion from the newcomer, the narration strangely and suddenly turns to the decor of the scene, which had until then been only barely alluded to, the text being entirely focused on the character's internal turmoil. I'll read the English. Elisa had stood up and was playing with the fringe of the tablecloth. Her eyes were fixated on a little box on which Paul was painted, throwing himself in the furious waves after Virginie. Immediately after this short parenthetical notation, the conversation between the narrator Elisa and her mother resumes, and no other mention of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's novel is made in the rest of the work. At first glance, this very brief reference to Paul et Virginie in Haïkouni's Elisa appears to be little more than a somewhat insignificant detail in the plot. At best, the picture painted on the box, which evokes the tragic and untimely death of two archetypal lovers, can be read as a form of foreshadowing of the fate that awaits Haïkouni's own characters. I argue, however, that there is more there than what meets the eye, and that the painted box needs to be literally opened to a deeper interpretation in order to unpack its exact function within the novel as a whole. There was, in fact, nothing particularly surprising in finding a visual reference to Paul et Virginie on a decorative object described in the mid-19th century novel. Indeed, the particularly broad circulation of the novel immediately after its original French publication and throughout the following century was accompanied by the production on truly a continent-wide scale of a plethora of visual and material representations based on iconic episodes in the novel. I have very quickly a few examples. This is a decorative plate with the death of Virginie. This is a postcard that was used as inexplicably as a publicity leaflet for a shirt manufacturer. It has, of course, no relationship whatsoever with the plot of the novel. This is an Image d'Épinal. Really, more than any other novel before it, the story of Paul et Virginie rapidly escaped the realm of exclusive textuality and became integrated into the visual, and perhaps even more so, into the material culture of its time. So let us go back to the scene alluded to in Haïkouni's Elisa, this Armenian novel. Although the overall scene it represents, Virginie's death, so I'm talking about the scene painted on the box, Virginie's death in the wreck of the ship that brings her back from France, constituted by far the most famous episode in the novel and was included in the form of an illustration in virtually every single edition of the text from its original publication until the end of the 19th century. The precise moment within the scene in question, Paul's attempt to rescue his lover, was very rarely the focus of visual and material presentations inspired by the work. More often, representations of the tragic event on which the novel ends tended to place an emphasis on the female character and showed Virginie alone on the sinking ship a few instants before her demise, or in other cases, her dead body, just like in this one, her dead body washed ashore after the tempest. The focus on Paul in the scene, in the description by Haïkouni of the scene painted on the box, is thus relatively unusual, but more importantly, it presents important discrepancies with respect to what actually exists in the novel. While in Haïkouni's novel, Paul is represented as throwing himself in the sea to try to rescue Virginie, the character's approach in the novel is in fact slightly more cautious. I have here a relatively rare example of an illustration of that scene that shows Paul and not Virginie's dead body. Here is the, I don't have time to read it, here is the passage in question. He's actually proceeding very carefully by tying a rope around his waist, which is not at all the description on the box. By not including that detail in the novel, by removing any presence of them, any mention of the presence of other characters like the slaves who are on the beach with Paul at that moment, the Armenian novelist added immensely to the pathos of an already very melodramatic scene and subtly diverged from the plot of the novel. Thus, the process of progressive autonomization of the visual presentations of Paul et Virginie with respect to the text that inspired them was fully at play in that Armenian novel, and for all its brevity, the mention of the painted box in the heroine's boudoir reflected this trend in a relatively sophisticated way that a cursory reading would fail to reveal. When he described the image painted on the box, Haikouni in fact inserted in his Armenian novel the short ekphrasis of a picture, in all likelihood imaginary, which was itself based on an episode borrowed from another novel, whose plot it subtly transformed. The hidden complexity of the passage is further evidenced by a more discreet allusion to another short scene in Paul et Virginie, one that comes immediately after the shipwreck episode. In this passage, the narrator walks to the shore, accompanied by one of the slaves, and discovers the dead body of Virginie, described as follows. So she's dead, she's holding a small box, and inside the box is, so a different box than the one in the Armenian novel, and that box is a portrait of her lover, Paul. Read together with the corresponding passage in the Armenian novel Elisa, this short description reveals the great sophistication of the mise en scène staged by Haikouni, who, through the reference to a material object present in both the French and the Armenian novel, made the two works subtly mirror one another. In the Armenian novel, Elisa looks at an image on a box representing the tragic death of Virginie, heroine of a French novel, as well as Paul attempts to rescue her. In parallel, the object that captures Elisa's attention echoes a similar object, another box containing a picture of Paul that her now dead double keeps in her embrace beyond death. In the light of the complex dialogue between Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's and Haikouni's respective novels, I argue that in Elisa, the image on the box can be interpreted as playing a part akin to that of the figure in the carpet in the homonymous short story by Henry James, that of a seemingly unimportant detail, which in fact carries, if correctly identified, the potential to uncover the overall architecture of the work that contains it, and functions perhaps as the repository of the essential meaning, voluntarily hidden from sight by the author. There exists, however, an important difference between James's carpet and Haikouni's box. Unlike the former, the latter is a tri-dimensional object, one that can be opened or closed, and that possesses therefore both an inside and an outside. I suggest that what is hidden in the painted box is Haikouni's depth to the sentimental fiction of the late Enlightenment, and what is represented on the box is the author's attempt at attenuating, through commodification, the importance of that very same genre for his own writerly practice. I'll skip a few parts of my talk to skip to the second text I want to talk about tonight, briefly, which is one of the two Ladino translations of the text. But keep this idea of commodification that I retained from my reading of Haikouni. So, as I mentioned, Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's novel was translated twice into Ladino, very late, already early into the 20th century, in 1901 and 1905. I will focus on the second of these two translations, whose translation was much larger than the first one. The translation was by Alexandre Ben-Ghiat, and it was in fact little more than a summary of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's novel. And as such, I think offers a new vantage point from which to look at issues of commodification of the Enlightenment novel in the Ottoman Empire. Published in book form in Jerusalem, Pablo y Virginie had in fact been originally serialized in El Meseret, which was a Ladino language newspaper published in Izmir, of which Ben-Ghiat was the director. He was also, he collaborated, I don't have time to go over his biography, but he collaborated with a great number of Ladino publications in both Thessaloniki and in Cairo and in other cities. His most important endeavor, publishing endeavor, was El Meseret, which was published between 1901 and the end of the First World War, and in which he included a very large number of summaries of Western novels. As in the case of all these summaries of Western novels published in El Meseret, Ben-Ghiat's Pablo y Virginie drastically condensed the plot of the French material. I have an example here of the very beginning. Much in the fashion of the Enlightenment novel, we are introduced to the story through a traveler to Mauritius who is shown the ruins of two houses, which we later learn are those of destroyed houses where Paul et Virginie's mothers lived. In the Ladino version, it's actually not their houses, it's their tombs. So we learn from the very first page that the two heroes are dead, and that's really from the very, very first paragraph. So the cuts are massive. We go from a large novel to one that is barely 20 pages long. So what is left of it? Ben-Ghiat subjected the text to a real process of cannibalization. And most of the Ladino version focused, in fact, on one single episode in the plot, incidentally the same that was represented in the box, on the box in Elisa's novel, The Wreck of the Ship and the Death of Virginie. Thus the original French sentimental novel was reduced to really an anecdote. From pseudo-philosophical novel, it becomes really the story of a shipwreck. It's about 18 pages out of the total of 20. And what I find interesting, and I'll close with this since I'm running out of time, is that it is important to pay attention to the context in which this is published in this Ladino newspaper. If you look, I don't have a picture here, but this short summary of this Enlightenment novel published an entire century later as a summary would really be adjacent to, in this newspaper published in Izmir, to news of a maritime nature and to perhaps articles about actual shipwrecks. So the context is entirely changed. The commodification is really fully at play, and extracting really just an anecdote from this Enlightenment novel, this Ladino author writing in the for this bourgeois audience of made out of merchants for a great number in Izmir, is turning it into really a maritime anecdote. While in the case of Haïkouni's Elisa, a Western European novel like Paul et Virginie was turned into a commodity, truly an object, in Alexandre Ben-Ghiat's Pablo et Virginie, the process of commodification and appropriation implied stripping the work of most of its philosophical implications in order to make it pliable enough to fit the purposes with which it became invested in its Ladino version, and to allow it to enter in dialogue with other texts, not exclusively fictional anymore, that belong to registers far removed from that of its original context of publication. Thank you.